Welcome back to another video on my channel. Today I thought I would do something a little bit more like informative, kind of like 2 weeks ago where I did a class where I made a video talking about a class I took with Paloma Ghosh, and it was about writing little monsters. So today I thought I would do another video reflecting on information that I got at a class I took. It's kind of a class. I went to a writing conference last November in 2024. There was a bunch of different authors there, but the keynote speaker there was Mona Awad. If you've watched this channel, you know she is one of my favorite authors of all time. So she was a keynote speaker there, and she also kind of taught a class on horror, or like how to write horror. So I thought I would give you guys some information that I learned from that experience and share it all with you guys today. So if you're interested in learning more about that, just keep on watching. Okay, just a recap on who Mona Awad is for you guys in case you don't know. Her most famous book and my favorite book is called Bunny, and I don't have it with me, but I will put the picture right here because my copy of Bunny is in a different room. I got a signed copy. It's pretty sweet. But she's written Bunny, and she's kind of like in the news right now because one, I think they're turning Bunny into a film, so that's going to be very exciting to see how that's going to be translated onto the big screen. Because if you've read Bunny, you know it's like a trippy dippy kind of book, and it is very unclear at times what is going on, whether like there's a blending of like reality and other stuff. So I won't spoil it, but like she wrote Bunny. That's my favorite of her work. But she also wrote this book called Rouge, and I've also read All's Well, which is based on All's Well That Ends Well and Macbeth. She's also written 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl. Something she likes to do is play with this idea of like horror and whimsy. So a lot of the books she's written are like inspired by fairy tales in a certain way. Bunny is inspired by The Hare's Bride and Beauty and the Beast. Rouge is definitely more like a Snow White inspired story. It's pretty apparent there. And then All's Well is, like I told you before, more of a theatrical focus, which is more about All's Well That Ends Well and Macbeth, which are two Shakespearean plays. That's kind of like what she does. She likes to reinvent folk tales and explore darker themes within folk tales. Bunny is hilarious to me because it's so self-referential at times, and she kind of makes fun of herself at certain points, which I appreciate. Sometimes when authors write like self inserts, sometimes it can be very jarring for me and I dislike it. But in this case, I thought it was hilarious, especially with Bunny. So that's just my plug for her. So all this to say, like a movie's coming out for Bunny, but also the second edition. Well, I was going to say sequel, but technically I think it's being marketed as a sequel and a prequel, which I don't know how they're going to do that. But that got dropped. Like the cover of that got dropped a couple days ago. I signed up for an ARC read, fingers crossed, or like a early read. So fingers crossed that I get that. I'm very excited about that. So I'll put the cover here so you guys can see, but it is a prequel and a sequel to Bunny, which is her most popular work. So I'm sure that's going to be a wild ride. I'm very excited for that. So I'm going to go over the two sessions that she kind of had during that weekend excursion. The first kind of speech or class she gave was called Down the Rabbit Hole. And of course, that's a reference to Bunny. And some of the things that stood out to me, I have like notes on here. So I'm going to try to use my memory in the notes to decipher like the most important bits from that session. But the first thing she really pointed out was giving yourself permission to fail and permission to play your way out of something when it comes to writing and creativity and stuff like that. Like you should just not be afraid to play around with whatever's there. With that, it's important to also play with the genre as well. So she was kind of talking about like avoiding like boxed in tropes because it could make things feel a little bit less dimensional and meaningful, and the importance of wanting the stakes in the story to feel real, like real high stakes or whatever, to feel realistic. Something also she brought up, which I thought was important to remember, especially if you're writing something with like surrealism or a touch of horror or a touch of like fantasy elements to them, is the differences in logic, right? So there is daytime logic, which is logical and casual in sense. There is nighttime logic or nighttime scenarios that feel mysterious to us and we don't really know, so maybe our logic would be impaired by that. But then there's dream/intuitive logic. It's decision making you don't necessarily make in nighttime logic. Like if you think about nighttime, you might have like heightened senses because it's dark, it's scary. There could be a monster in the night, so your logic is going to be affected by that in your decision making. But if you think about like dreamlike logic and intuitive logic, it's more of like this blurring of reality and the sleepiness. So you aren't necessarily thinking clearly. Within dreams you feel emotions but not necessarily your senses, if that makes sense. So this is the area she tends to write in, and it has worked out well for her branding of horror. But paired with that, something she likes to do is have a grounding voice that's committed to communicating consciousness. Like, this person is not asleep, but they're in this state between dream and reality, right? There's something about it that grounds the story, so you don't feel like this person is just completely out of it, but you can tell that their decision making is impaired because they're in this dreamlike logic, or they're in this dreamlike state where maybe they're not making decisions that normal people would make. There is this sense of whimsy, but at the same time, like, a reader can get lost in that, so it's important to have a grounding voice. But in that way, when you do that, the reader doesn't really know what the line is between reality and dream. Something that I wrote down that I like literally just quoted her on because I found that really, really fascinating. She wrote down the sentence, "Wonder is a sister to horror." In this way, you kind of have, like, when you're writing really enriching horror, you kind of have like opposite sensations sometimes. And even though one would assume that wonder, like being excited about something new, would be opposite to horror, in actuality they are still of the same sort of emotion, right? When it comes to something new, something fantastical, something magical, wonder and horror can be sisters, and they can coexist at the same time. Like, you can have this fascination with something, this allureness or whatever, but then still have this fear about whatever the main antagonist or plot point in the story may be. And she encourages people writing within horror to embrace the idea of the dream, embracing the dream, right? Embrace that dream like state, because again, with dreams and with nightmares, you have the same sort of wonder and horror in the same breath. So with that, she also talks about magic, horror, and humor to explore reality, incorporating humor in that as well. In her example, she talked about All's Well, which is a story about a woman living with chronic pain and the transformative magic of theater. In this way, she like constrained herself because a lot of the book actually takes place from the theater and stage. And in this way, when she's on stage, it's more reflective of the play that's like All's Well, which is the woman whose main character is a college professor who used to be an actress, and she's insisting that her students put on All's Well instead of Macbeth, which is what's more popular with them, it's what the students want to do. But the irony of that is that while we see All's Well play out on stage for her in her actual waking life, it is literally just Macbeth. All the magic that she experiences is similar to the plot points of Macbeth. In this way, she plays with the idea of a fever dream. Also in the book, it's a little bit questionable because the protagonist is also taking a lot of painkillers. Having these experiences where one doesn't really know if she is hallucinating them or if they're legit. Yeah, but there is a blurring between reality and what we perceive to be as fiction in that book specifically. But like, when you play with a fever dream, you venture deeper into voice and perspective, pacing and flow. You also have to kind of play with the state and the diction and the voice of the character as well. So a lot of times what she does to express like giddiness, like where somebody is clearly not in their right mind and they're like essentially manic and giddy, an easy way to portray that is to have your characters speak in rhyme, or to have their sentences end in questions, right? Like they're constantly questioning something as well. For example, when we're talking about her methodology with All's Well, or with like Shakespeare in general, something that was brought up was the idea of using florid speech and Roman routes versus simple words with Saxon origin, which with the Saxon origin is indicative of witches speak. So that is something that also kind of pertains to Macbeth and like her decision making when writing her book All's Well. And this can produce hallucinogenic effects on the page. So it's not even like describing what is happening, but when you're describing the character's voice or the character's experiences through that, you can see them questioning their own inner monologues. If they speak in rhyme, that is more so a like it calls back to like nursery rhymes, but in like a trickster kind of way, you know, like this magical realism that's really present in like folk tales and stuff. She also talked about how to write obsession. So not only madness, but obsession. When you write obsession, you have to keep in mind that reason can't save us. Facts ultimately mean nothing. And when viewed at a distance, this is funny. So she also used her own writing as an example. So she talked about envy and obsession. So this is more so regarded to Rouge. In Rouge, it is a story about a woman who experiences the death of her mother. But something unique about this character is that she's really, really into skincare, like almost obsessed with watching skincare YouTube videos and buying all these products and having like a gajillion step skincare routine, which is ultimately causes or potentially causes her downfall, right? It's about skincare, but it's also about colorism because in the book, I believe the main character is of mixed race descent and her mother is white, and her mother was like a Hollywood person, very like well known and beautiful. And so in this way, there's this like envy of her mother's beauty and like social mobility through her skin. And so the main character is obsessed with skincare in the same way, even though she doesn't maneuver the world with the same beauty as her mother. And although she doesn't indulge in like fashion and clothes the same way her mother does, it's still like ultimately a part of her. And again, this is very like Snow White-esque in my opinion. So again, with the skincare video obsessions, it relates to like witches' potions. Like there's this idea of folk magic, like there's some magic potion that will automatically make me more beautiful, and maybe that is reflective of how my life will be moving forward. There is also the mother-daughter binary, which is so present in so many different like folk tales, especially when it comes to like witches and princesses and like evil stepmoms or evil moms and stuff. This was a notable dynamic that tends to lean unfavorably in these like folk tales, and so that's something she really wanted to explore as well within Rouge. And something to remember too in this context is like the object of fear is the object of desire, which leads to obsession, right? So there is this fear of aging, of mortality, desperation, like death avoidance, really like a fear of death. Like because in Rouge, basically, she kind of finds this like not cult, but it feels like a beauty cult that her mother might have been a part of that promotes beauty treatments to keep people young forever or young looking forever. And it's implied that like the mother did this as well, even though the daughter does a different kind of skincare. So post mother's death, the daughter finds herself trickling into this, right? And what is honestly like for the beauty industry as a whole, especially like skincare, it is an avoidance of age, right? And what is the fear of age but a fear of death, right? And when we age, we lose our luster and appeal, sure, but we also are reminded that we are that much closer to our demise. So, a lot of people out of that fear become obsessed with beauty treatments, skincare treatments, makeup, whatever, to make up for the fact that they are suppressing this fear. So this is what she talks about when she's talking about the object of your desire is also the object of your fear. So this is the example she uses for that. And that ultimately we are drawn to what will destroy us, which is in itself absurd, right? It is a huge contradiction of human nature to be drawn to what will ultimately destroy us. And so in the story, within the cult, there's people that go further and further and further into these beauty treatments until they themselves ultimately meet their demise in some really, really strange way. I will not tell you what that is because I don't want to spoil the entire book for you. But the promise of youth and the promise of feeling beautiful and the promise of even living in this like because even when they get these beauty treatments, it affects their memory, it affects their uh ability to think, and that puts them in the streamlined state, like what Mona Awad has been writing about. It puts them in that state where their judgment is impaired as well. But also it takes away the bad memories, right? It takes away the bad feelings, it takes away all that we dislike. But ultimately, because of that craving for youth, happiness, a fresh start, all of that is ultimately the demise in the story. In and of itself is absurd, and that's where the humor and satire kind of comes in when you're playing with horror. If you're really working on like fleshing out a complex story with like some sort of messaging in it, incorporating humor and satire is a great way to do that. So that was the first kind of speech she gave, and I know that took forever for me to get out. The second class, she presentation she did was called Playing with the Shadow, and I'll have pictures of it somewhere because I think I took pictures of it. But Playing with the Shadow, which again is kind of like a masterclass on writing horror in itself. Some of the things that she pointed out is one, the importance of playing on philosophical or existential crises within your horror. She also referenced a lot of other works and brought up book recommendations during this class. So she talked about Stephen King's hierarchy of scares, right? How you break down how you scare someone, drifting from the most basic level to more psychological. The first one is the gross out, right? Where it's just icky. You are scared because this is icky. This can involve sever heads, body horror, things like that. The second level is the horror, which is reflective in the unnatural, right? There is a twist on something that, like, something that could be seen as natural, but then it becomes unnatural in some sort of way. So this could be more of creature building, a contortion on like maybe like a giant spider or something like that. It's like the play on what is seen as natural versus unnatural. And then the final level of the hierarchy of scares is terror, right? And in this case, it could be something like, oh, there's nothing there, but in reality, you're perceiving something, but there's like nothing there. So it plays more on like your psychological scares and like your perception of reality, right? So there's like base level gross. There is unnatural, something that's there and you can perceive it, but it's slightly off. And then there is the terror, which is like this internal feeling of dread or like you're on edge because you feel unsafe and you're perceiving something that isn't there. When something is less visible and less seen, that means your imagination kicks in and there is less evidence to support what you're feeling. So one of the examples she brought up to illustrate this was the Twilight Zone airplane episode. We actually watched a clip from this, but I will put in a picture around here in case you aren't familiar with this episode. Please watch it. I am a big fan of the Twilight Zone. It's actually inspired my first horror short story collection, Cursed Images. I wanted it to feel kind of like the Twilight Zone, and like each short story was like an episode of the Twilight Zone, but not really, but done in like a very Y2K type setting. So anyway, the airplane episode is probably one of the most popular episodes of Twilight Zone. It's pretty iconic. So basically, there's this guy on an airplane, and he's already afraid of flying to begin with. But then when he looks out the window of the airplane, he sees this like giant gorilla thing messing with the plane. And he's paranoid and he's like, oh my God, oh my God. And he's trying to get the attention of his wife and the flight attendant and everybody else to say, like, oh yeah, there's this guy on the wing of the plane. There's a guy on the wing of the plane. But every time they go to look, he like disappears. It really messes with him to the point where he thinks he's like the only one that can see it, or like he's trying to doubt himself as well, even though he's perceiving this. So the fear comes in because nobody sees what he sees, and it could potentially be all in his head versus it really happened and I can't believe what I see, right? That's the two juxtapositions of that episode. So either it's all in his head or he is actually happening and I can't believe it, right? I can't believe this giant gorilla creature is messing with the airplane. When you write horror, everything interesting happens between these two poles, right? That's what she said. Everything interesting happens between these two options. She also played the clip from The Shining, the movie, which is also Stephen King, where the little boy Danny's on his tricycle and he's just kind of like chilling through the hallways and he sees like the twins and stuff and all the ghosties that are kind of messing with him. And then there's that scene like where all the blood comes rushing into. It's kind of wild. In this clip for Danny, you have to realize, is this real or am I dreaming? Is this real really happening? Is like this actually happening to me? Or is this, am I in some sort of dreamlike state? Is something more fantastical at play? So what is the fantastic? In this case, he's in the ambiguous zone, and there's different types of this. So I'm just going to read them all off to you. So when you're in the ambiguous zone, it can be anywhere between uncanny and familiar, but unattainable. It can be marvelous or it can be an impossible reality. In this case, it could be demons don't exist, but my senses are off and I'm experiencing these things. Or demons do exist, but the world is not what I thought it was anymore, right? So in this case, with ghosts or demons or whatever, it's like they don't exist, but there's something wrong with me because I'm perceiving this. My senses are off. My mentality is skewed, whatever, because I am experiencing this, but they don't exist. Or demons do exist, and that changes my entire worldview on everything, which is also terrifying. So those two options are also interesting to play with. She gives even more examples of different writing techniques. She talks about Brian Evanson's The Shimmering Wall. In that example, we talk about a similar dichotomy. It's either I do not know the world or I do not know myself, which kind of relates back to the demons things. The importance of having an unreliable narrative, an unreliable narrator. This can be a way to be very intimate with your reader and very disclosing, but there's limitations with an unreliable narrator where you can't really trust their thoughts, their language in the face of certain occurrences, right? There's also this thing where people and I found that this is common in some like Lovecraftian horror with an unreliable narrator. They can't fully communicate to you, the reader, what is happening, and that is repeated over and over again. They are so scared out of their wits' end that they can't accurately describe what's going on, or they can't accurately talk about their feelings because they're just at a loss for words. So that's one option to do with a unreliable narrator. She also brings up the example of Slate House by David Mitchell. In this piece, there's no emotional reporting at all. It's just description, and because of this, it gives the reader room to be frightened by using your senses and repetition. One thing that's great about horror, or some tool that you want to use in horror, is repetition over and over again. It creates this sense of uneasiness and really gets certain descriptions apart, so it sticks in the head of your reader. I know in general there is a rule with like general writing about not wanting to be repetitive in language, because you don't want it to be jarring for your reader. Like if you use the same word over again when you write, sometimes that's a little distracting for your reader. It makes it seem like you don't have a very like varied vocabulary. But in this instance, repeating the same sort of phrases of dialogue or repeating similar descriptions, using different variations of the color red when you're describing like a bloody scene or something, or emphasizing certain textures over and over again, certain sounds, can really kind of put like a ticking time bomb in your reader's head and get them to feel that tension a little bit more. So writing horror is a little bit different than writing normally because it does encourage repetition when in moments of crisis, if that makes sense. Now there are like an additional set of notes that I kind of wanted to talk about. Something that she emphasized is horror is literal. In this case, what she likes to emphasize, it's not as if he's there, he's really there. It's not a metaphor. This makes things feel a little bit more concrete for your reader and might have them second guess their level of sanity along with the narrator or whoever the main character is in your story. So that is one interpretation, that horror is literal, but then you have also horror as allegory, or horror being allegorical, right? So there's one, the literal level of the story, right? What's going on? Is there a monster? Is there a cult happening, turning people into uh mindless zombies? I don't know. So the literal level of the story. 2, having some sort of human issue occurring. 3, the horror genre as a whole, or the horror genre itself, like being self-referential, right? Being meta. So my first thought when I think of this and what she brought up in this example is Scream. Scream, the movie, is completely meta. It is a movie dissecting the horror genre itself, right? Using tropes from the horror genre and being self-referential in Scream of like how you survive a horror movie. Well, you don't have sex in a car, or you don't break away from the group or whatever. They play those jokes in that movie, and it's self-referential in their way. Scream's also based off a real story. I don't know if you guys know that, but Scream is actually based off of like an actual true crime case where these guys were watching like a lot of scary movies and decided to enact them. Now that I'm thinking out loud, I'm going to put editing me in charge, and she's going to find out which one came first. But I think the true crime case came out before Scream. I don't think that they did it after Scream, but I will correct myself right here. The fun thing about being meta or being self-referential is that there is another opportunity for humor there if you're making fun of yourself as a horror writer. And when you include humor in the story, one thing that could be really beneficial is that if you write funny moments or ironic things or whatever in that point, it has the reader let their guard down. And this is something I do within my own work as well. There is like in my stories, I think there is a level of humor involved when I write my short stories. The first one I can think of is Murmur, which I think is funny. I don't know. It might be hit or miss for people. But when I was writing Murmur, It's a story about these kids who summon a demon in their backyard, but instead of using like Latin or something that you would stereotypically think of, they use like early 2000s text speak. So it's like rar xd, or like abbreviations of words that's like kind of hard to read initially, or capital letter, capital letter, small letter, like how we used to type back then, to be a little bit more alternative. And honestly, my sister did this more than I did. I definitely abbreviated words, but I never made like any zany capital or lowercase letters, but my sister did that all the time. So that was the inspiration behind that story, which again, when you see that language on the page, one, it's jarring. You're like, oh my God, what is this? Two, it's nostalgic because once you realize what it is, you're like, oh my God, yeah, I remember that. And three, it's kind of humorous because you look back and you're like, oh, we were so silly. And it's kind of a silly idea that kids are summoning, like this became its own dead cryptic language, even though this is a modern language. Modern in that sense, it's like a texting language. So there's a lot of absurdities and kind of irony and like fun there that allows the reader to let down their guard for a minute. When they let down their guard and when you have humor included, it relieves tension for a minute, but then it makes the terror a lot worse later, right? I don't know if you're used to watching scary movies or not, but when you are constantly like tense like this and you're like waiting for the jump scare or whatever, you're like mentally preparing, like, oh my God, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. And so sometimes the impact's just a little bit of shudder because like you prepared yourself for that, right? But then sometimes when you have a movie where there's like a bit of a gag, like maybe you're anticipating this jump scare and something happens and it's just like a duck or whatever, you're like a little baby duck or something, and you're like, oh man, I didn't need to be scared. Whew, what a relief. And then all of a sudden it's like, something scary right after that. They do that because it plays with your physicality and like it makes the impact of the scare worse when you have your guard down like that. So humor can be very, very effective in a horror story, and it's something to include. And a way to include that is through just as an example of being meta, like referencing horror stuff. So like in my example, I know the trope of summoning a demon. I know it's supposed to be Latin. It's supposed to be a dead language. It's supposed to be something old and ancient. So me flipping that on its head and making it different that way is the humor that kind of makes the reader a little bit more comfortable. But then when the demon starts doing demon things, it's a little bit scary later on because you're like, oh wait, I didn't expect that. Like I was expecting something fun, and then it turns out to be scary. So yeah. And so the fourth level of allegory for horror, she calls the clouds of unknowing. This can be having some sort of religious experience or at the horizon of our understanding. So again, this is a step above meta, above being self-knowing, and it's about like more of what's unknown, right? Tapping into what's unknown. It could be again a something like the demons where it is more of a shock and more of a reference to that religious experience, or it can be horror as in like to the vastness of space and something we cannot comprehend, and it's a reflection of the fear of unknown out there as well. So the last page I have is more about like techniques of horror. Something she brings up is something called the unnerving banality. So when you use something that's familiar to establish comfort, but you use that something that's familiar to also you contort it into something scary. Again, I love doing this. A lot of what I do is I write horror relating to toys or technology, something that's with us all the time. Like as a child in childhood, it's comfortable because you have a comfort toy, or even as an adult, we rely on technology so much it becomes a comfort to us. But then I contort it and I twist it a little bit way to make it unnerving, right? I personally really appreciate this, but some examples she used is the morning chapter or speech from American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. That one was like a whole monologue talking about someone's morning routine to the point where it became unnerving because you know this person is like a killer and they don't do great things, and you can see bits of that weave through within their morning routine. Something else to keep in mind, like visually, if you've seen Jaws, there's that scene where there's like building tension and you know something's going to happen, but like the most like it's the part where you're observing everybody just playing on a beach, like something so normal, something so everyday, everyone's just kind of playing on the beach, but the guy is like scanning for the shark or Jaws. There's something going on, like there's this feeling of dread, but with each like beach ball that gets kicked around or each little kid in a swimsuit running by, you're just waiting in anticipation for that next thing because it feels unnerving, even though it is something that shouldn't be. Something else to keep in mind is the odd detail. This one's really fun. Focusing in on a small detail can destabilize our feelings of comfort during the scene. The scene that she pointed out, which again I haven't seen before, but when I saw it, I was like, "Ooh, baby girl, this is scary." Was a scene from The Killing of a Deer, and it's a spaghetti scene. It's a scene in this movie where this guy kind of like sits down and he's talking to this woman, or this woman shows up and he's like sitting down, and the entire time he's talking to her, he's just literally eating spaghetti. But what he's discussing is like a relative of his committing murder because of this lady's involvement in their family life. And it's like so nonchalant and flat of him just discussing it, but all he's doing is just slurping fucking spaghetti. Sorry, I swore, but like he's just slurping spaghetti over and over again. And it's just like you feel like, one, what the heck? Like, what? Like, it's a normal thing, but it's not a normal thing. Like, it's not a normal reaction in this context. And it's like specifically about the spaghetti, but also when you see it, you see the red sauce and it's kind of like blood, but like not really, because it's just a correlation you make in your mind that you know it's like not right. But again, the act itself is innocent, but it doesn't feel right because of the detail. It like messes with your emotions. So it's really cool. So another technique you can do is something called the proximity to caricature. So that's when a character on screen is kind of overplayed in certain ways, where it verges on caricature for comedic effect, but really something remains strange and off about it. The example she gave is Ruth, the neighbor, in Rosemary's Baby. If you haven't seen Rosemary's Baby, please do. I love that movie. That movie is like very old. It's like an older movie. It's a little bit vintage, but Rosemary's Baby is it's really good. It's really good. If you are somebody who has the potential to be pregnant and that scares you, maybe you shouldn't watch Rosemary's Baby, because it's about this young couple and she gets pregnant and the neighbors are all up in her business about her pregnancy, and turns out there's like a cult going on in the building, so somewhat, and I won't say much more than that, but they get really involved in her pregnancy, let's just say that. Well, Ruth is kind of played up to be this like nosy neighbor, this like older woman, and you can tell at first, you might even miss it, like when she's like kind of getting up in her business and going through her things, she's just this like nosy neighbor. But then you can tell, like, as she's moving through the space, that something additional is going on, like something else is off. So that's also a kind of way to play into that. It could indicate that there's something else going on here, in relation to something that could be a perfectly normal scene with like an older nosy neighbor, but then it's pushed a little too far. So this last bit is kind of just echoing things from the first lesson, but this is the last little bit I took notes on, so I'm just going to remind you what they are. It's important to know when writing horror, what is holding hands with fear. Fear shouldn't be the only emotion when trying to write multidimensional horror, right? You need fear and something else. So what other emotions are there besides fear? For me, with my first short story project, and I think why it's so successful is because there are feelings in those stories outside of fear. In some stories in particular, I really tapped into this feeling of like, this is going to be really sad, I'm sorry, but like abandonment and loneliness a little bit within the fear, because I remember being left to my own devices at times as a kid, or having these feelings of loneliness in my household as a child. And I think that really comes through with some of the stories there, especially in my Webkin story. Oftentimes, like, that story is pretty much about things that happen out of neglect, the harm that can happen out of neglect. And so there are other feelings besides fear. Fear walks in hand with this feeling of isolation and loneliness, which I think is an instinctual fear for a lot of folks. But also, like I said, this feeling of nostalgia for a time that could have been better, but then you realize it might not have been as good as you remember it. So there's nostalgia involved as well. Coming to terms with disappointment in reality. Like, things feel so shiny and new and colorful when you're a kid, but then when you go to relive those experiences as an adult, sometimes they can be somewhat disappointing. I think those were feelings that a lot of people had during the pandemic as well, because a lot of people returned to hobbies or activities they did when they were younger to kind of alleviate this sense of impending dread. But I wanted to play with the idea of like, what if that happens to you? What if you're disappointed in that? Like, what if it's not what you remember? What if it feels even more isolating in addition to that? So that's kind of like what I did as an example. But going back to that, a lot of times you can't scare a reader unless they believe. So you got to tap into some commonality with the reader or some universal emotion that they might also have, in order to cast a spell on them, right? What Mona Awad does is she plays with this idea of wonder and curiosity. So again, like before, how we talked about how wonder is a sister to horror, wonder, curiosity, wanting to follow that trail to see what could happen at the end, wanting to fall down the rabbit hole like Alice in Wonderland to experience what may come out for better or for worse on the other side. That is also important to have. For me, when I employed the sense of curiosity, it's curiosity through the familiar. I gave you a path that you want to go down because you have had familiar experiences with this through nostalgia and you want to revisit but it goes left and it does not do as well as you think it does. Some more tips is to be very specific with your narration, and to when, especially if you want to show someone descending into madness or being scared and freaked out, use small words with repetition. If you are scared out of your mind, you're not going to use a word like like frivolous or something like that to describe your current scenario. If you are panicking and out of your mind, I don't care how intelligent you are probably using brief short words to try to describe what's going on, or you are trying to use that language to just, I mean, you're just in instinct mode, survival mode whatsoever. So it's more realistic to use small words and repeat those small words in moments of crisis than to be overtly poetic when writing horror in that way. So it's just interesting tips for you guys. That's all I have for today. I hope you found this video to be helpful in some sort of way. Again, this is the advice that I found to be most important during these 2 classes with Mona Awad. I know she also teaches at the college level in New York, her classes. So this is a woman who's had a wonderful career and really knows her stuff. And I was lucky enough to be able to sit in and learn from her. So I just wanted to pass on some of this information for you guys as well. Please go support her and pick up some of her books. I promise you'll enjoy them. If you're anything like me, you will definitely enjoy them. And be on the lookout for the prequel / sequel of Bunny to drop soon. I'm very excited about that. If you've read Bunny, be on the lookout for that. It's going to be awesome. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please like this video. Comment something down below that's relevant to this video, maybe something you learned, I don't know. Share this video with a friend, share it with another writer friend who you think that could help. And then go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Please, please, please. That will help me out a lot. And until next time, thanks. Bye.